to go?
Yep.
All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Alan Fye, Director of Programs and Policy. Mr. Alcorn, our chair of the WMATA Committee, is running a little bit late, but he asked us to go ahead and get started this evening. So we're starting this evening at 6:05 for the WMATA Committee. This meeting is being live streamed to allow our listening audience to be able to watch it on YouTube. The first item on the agenda is the April 19th MVTC WMATA Committee meeting summary. We shared that with the meeting materials that were sent out last week. If anybody had a chance to take a look at them, have any changes or edits to those? If not, we'll tonight we're going to get an update on MVTC's Metro Operating Working Group. Staff will update us on the work that the staff level group has tasked to examine the structural funding challenges of WMATA, identify opportunities for transparency and oversight of WMATA, identify some potential funding sources for future consideration as the region tackles WMATA's longstanding need for dedicated operating funding. I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to give us an overview of the preliminary findings and recommendations from the working group, as well as walk us through how the findings will fit into our legislative required annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA that we send to the Governor and General Assembly every year. So Andrew, take it away.
Right, thank you, Alan. Let's advance to. So the working group is a staff level working group that the commission asked us to start earlier this year and last year. And the problem before the working group was the structural operating and capital funding deficits that Alan mentioned. Back in June, WMATA introduced the operating funding gap at that time, and we look forward to additional information available on that gap. But they put a lot of information and parameters out there about the problem. The general scale of these are, I think, beyond our jurisdiction's traditional reliance on property taxes that form their subsidies. And so one of the purposes of the group was to look at new revenues, specifically new Virginia revenues, and develop options and provide the commission with technical information. This committee and the Legislative and Policy Committee would be the NVTC committees where we seek policy guidance. And on slide 5, illustrated just sort of a conceptual approach to how we're looking at this. We're looking again at Virginia revenues. There are 2 tasks before the working group, eventually being a report that a technical report that we will provide in December. But the 2 pieces are the funding and the reform piece. So we're going to tackle revenue estimates and different types of revenue sources in a month at the joint legislative and WMATA committee meeting. So we'll have that information in about a month. On the reform side, that's what we've put forth today, partially to structure the conversation. But as I said, those revenue sources will be a menu, but the recommendations we'll talk about the structure of that revenue, and then any other policy recommendations that kind of make sense in space, as well as some reform and accountability recommendations. As far as the timeline, we're sort of on starting the back half here, where the working group has met several times. We've had interviews, engaged with our colleagues, DC, Maryland, COG, and at Metro, and we're just getting started to produce a draft report and then eventually a final report. As I'll mention later, this is pairing up with our annual report on Metro that is required by code. And so the recommendations will find itself in that report. But the overall technical working group report with that menu of revenue options will be just that, a technical report. We do have future efforts sort of TBD here. I'll get into that later, but depending on how things go in the next sort of months and into next year, we're obviously preparing solutions here that could be applicable for a General Assembly session or a future session. We're trying to keep this sort of more longer term and sort of permanent looking set of potential solutions. We do have consultants. You can go to slide 7. Thank you, Sophie. We do have consultants who are helping us with these revenue estimates, and they also did an evaluation of sort of accountability and transparency measures with Metro and its peer agencies. And so what I'll do is introduce Nate Masek from HDR, and he will give us a brief run through of what they did and what they found.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. So one of the things we did as part of our study was to, emphasizing the reform part of the working group was to look at accountability measures and transparency measures that are in place at WMATA and at 7 peer agencies that are, national transit providers in other major cities. Most of these agencies also operate heavy rail systems. Most of them also operate bus and demand response as well. And these are peer agencies that WMATA is commonly compared to across the country. We looked at it in terms of the public information that each is putting out there on their website, the audit information that they have available and are circulating publicly, and then what sort of oversight the board exerts through a board audit committee. What we found was that WMATA actually measures up fairly well compared to its national peers. With public information on website, most of the categories, public performance metrics, performance dashboard, operating and capital budgets were all there and accessible on the website. The one thing that WMATA didn't have that others have is an investor relations page, which is usually aimed at bondholders or others that might hold debt from the agency to be able to see the financial performance of the public agency. So WMATA has the information that you would typically provide on an investor relations page online. It just isn't on a labeled investor relations page where it would be, in a clean, easy to find package. Audit information similarly was out there, and a lot of the information is available from WMATA's website. One thing is that audit reports and findings are a little bit scattered in terms of where they are. Some of it's on the Office of Inspector General's website, which is a separate website from WMATA's own website. And then some of the audits that might be by other entities that are not the OIG are elsewhere. So we don't have one repository where all these audits are all in one place. So again, this is partial credit. The information's all there. It just isn't in one easy repository. The other one is that board audit committee is something where most of the other agencies do have a board audit committee, but WMATA charges its executive committee with that role. So again, the function is there. It just is a slightly different organizational structure than most of its peers have at front.
All right, thanks, Nate. So again, WMATA did well compared to its peers, and very small kind of. As we move to the, thank you, Sophie. As I mentioned earlier, the working group is developing preliminary findings and recommendations that we're currently working through right now. We're intending to put findings in the sort of that technical report, and then the recommendations that in some cases pair with them. They will form the sort of the first chapter of our traditional annual report on the performance and condition of Metro, and the audience for that, again, is the governor of the General Assembly. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is walk through those and cover them in the following categories. So it'll talk about findings and then recommendations for those findings in each of those categories. There will be some common themes that emerge that I'll touch on sort of as we get to them. In terms of structural cost growth, the initial findings are, some of these are pulled from the 2017 LaHood report for those of you who go back to that and were with us then. But we looked at Metro's pensions and found that, like they were in 2017, they are better funded slightly than the Virginia retirement system. So they are in, and that's at about 84.36%. However, OPEB is still an ongoing issue, and Metro has consistently provided that information to the board and to the public. But that unfunded liability has improved since 2018. It's about 5% now. It was 0 in 2018. So there are certainly improvements, but it is a long-term risk to the operating budget. So that's not really news, but we did want to simply state that as a fact. Metro has found cost savings and efficiencies through aggressive management actions. They have demonstrated that annually, and it was slide deck in June. But there was a general feeling that from the jurisdictions that they would like greater detail. So that is something that we look forward to. In terms of the 3% operating cap, there was a lot of discussion around that. The general finding is that it is a useful tool to control costs and protect our funding jurisdictions, but it's important to state that it was based on a pre-pandemic financial model and has resulted in unintended consequences. And so what we mean on the pre-pandemic financial model is basically two things. There is no inflation adjuster in that, so inflation is very different now than it was in 2018. And WMATA's fair revenue picture post-pandemic is very, very different than it was in 2018. So that's sort of the two primary things we mean by that statement. And then the unintended consequences are that, and this is something we'll touch on in the slides that come later about Metro bus subsidy and service trends, but some of the unintended consequences of the cap are that it has altered Metro's subsidy allocation process in a way that distorts the amount of subsidy owed from the amount of service received. And so this has been an ongoing problem, and that in and of itself is reducing accountability to the jurisdictions who want to know essentially what, they want to know what they're paying for, basically. And so this has been a recurring problem, but as service continues to change in a post-pandemic environment, this issue recurs and becomes problematic. And then the last piece is just, again, another fact to state is that one result of the cap is that our jurisdictions cannot provide additional subsidy in Metro, either be it state aid or local revenues, without some sort of legislative modification. So subsidy was reduced during the pandemic, and so that is just sort of a fact we need to state here before we can move forward. In terms of the preliminary recommendations that go along here, we're emphasizing just additional communications on cost-saving measures at Metro, and we have provided some links and some suggestions here that our consultants found about some peer programs at SEPTA that show some annual reports and some other programs like that. Metro has an excellent joint development program, and so we have had continually offered the recommendation here to just keep doing what you're doing on increasing non-fare revenues from a variety of sources, and then jumping a little bit to the bottom of the slide for the 3% operating cap. What we are recommending here is that Virginia, and because remember there is a Virginia cap and a Maryland cap. Our suggestion here is to revise the cap. That would be to revise it to reflect structure. Should we put some sort of new dedicated operating revenue from the region online, we would need to revise that. And in doing so, we need to do it in a way that restores the accountability to that subsidy process, which is that unintended consequence that I mentioned earlier. But overall, our jurisdictions felt, some form of cap is still a useful tool to contain subsidy escalation. So going back to the middle of the slide here, recommendations here are for Metro to manage labor cost escalation through pension and other post-employment benefits. The recommendations to the Hood report. We have consistently offered Congress should seek amendments that require arbitrators and Metro contract mediations to consider Metro's fiscal condition and the jurisdiction's ability to pay. And then the next two here are not something the Metro can just do. I do want to be very clear about that. These are a product of collective bargaining. And so it's very much something we would offer as a recommendation for Metro to seek, but it is part of that process. And those were things that were also, again, either found in the Hood report or found in different OIG reports. In terms of operational and financial accountability, again, some simple findings here. Fares have not kept up with inflation. The last major fare increase was 2018. Very similar to what our consultants found, we wanted to build upon that recommendation about reports and other information, and simply state that since 2018, the quality and quantity of a variety of information, performance reporting, reporting on the capital program, ridership, open data portals, it's all improved. And some of those improvements have actually been made only in the last few weeks or months. Pulse came online, which helps show real-time information, and fare evasion data for rail was posted. on an online data portal. So a lot of really positive movement in that space. On, again, I think I touched on this earlier, on the subsidy side for Metrobus, we do have a challenge on the way the subsidy works, and that is associated with service. And so overall, our finding here is that formula for bus and its interaction with the cap is a broken process that is in need of an overhaul. Another finding that is near and dear to our jurisdiction's hearts is on predictability in the operating subsidy. So there is, again, a challenge with the 3% caps that while there is a cap on Virginia, there is no single Virginia payee. It's the 6 cities and counties that add up to that subtotal. And so from an individual perspective, they see a lot of movement on what their subsidy could be in the process. This sort of is not anyone's fault. This is just sort of an unintended consequence. And so if we are to stand up structure, I think there's a strong desire to have some additional level of predictability in that process. And lastly on here, and the commission has talked about this a lot, but fare evasion, as we know, has increased since 2019. Virginia has the lowest rates when compared to its peers. We do want to recognize here that Metro has taken a lot of steps to mitigate fare evasion, several of them very recently. But Metro must comply with evasion laws. On the recommendation side, we are recommending improving fare box recovery by considering fare raises, redesigning the Metrobus network to find efficiencies and cost savings, and this is actively underway through the Better Bus. So, our recommendation here is just continued engagement with that process that Metro is definitely reaching through, as well as how to come up with a new bus formula. So these are ongoing efforts that we are, again, encouraging movement through and working with our staff to help Metro move those forward. If there is any new reporting, our recommendation at this point is to the jurisdictions to kind of step back, catalog what's out there. As I said, there's a lot of information already being provided. And if there is to be new reporting requirements, make them uniform. And that's primarily aimed at, we can reduce the administrative burden for Metro to provide on reporting, and so that it can be done in one consistent way across the region. And then the last is enforcing fare payment uniformly across the system. That enforcement has restarted. I think it was about a year ago. But the additional recommendation here is to report on the occurrences and the fiscal impacts of fare evasion. And again, as I noted, Metro Rail, they call it TAPS and non-TAPS, but that information is in the data portal online, and that started, I believe, last month. So a lot of movement in that space. For oversight, I think staff gave this a lot of thought, and in looking at the oversight bodies for Metro, concluded that there are a great many, and so if there are additional oversight responsibilities, the region should consider assigning them to someone that already exists, and the first place they should start should be the Metro Board. That's sort of the simplest and best arrangement. The board is the governing body for Metro. And then the last here kind of pairs with what Nate found, that this is really a small technicality, but the Metro Board reviews audits regularly. So this is something that could be spelled out in bylaws, but additionally, there is a lack of coordination of jurisdictional audits. So that's not anyone's, that's really more directed at the jurisdiction. A lack of coordination, if we go to the next slide, is something that could addressed by formalizing an audit committee, and in this case, for the jurisdictions to the Metro Board stand up. It could be an advisory committee, and there's a number of options, but the main point of this recommendation here is that there should be protocols and procedures in place. If we have a new revenue or if we have a new funding structure, we need to just make sure we have that sort of good oversight and coordinate jurisdictional audits. That also fits with that larger theme of if Metro is going to do something for the jurisdictions, it should do it once, not like 12 different times in a way that it's so that's a bit on Metro, but that's also on the jurisdiction. So we actually want to amend that who that responsibility is assigned to. Just thought of that. And then last here is something that we have heard on occasion, but exploring options among the signatories authorities to provide compensation to Metro. So just to back up a little bit, the compact does not allow compensation. So this is not directed at Metro. This is sort of, the idea here is to start a conversation, given the sort of level of effort and hours the principal board provide to Metro, just to think about how they're compensated. We go to 15, thank you. On the funding side of things, I mean, we need to state affirmatively here that jurisdictional subsidies have not kept up with inflation. That is in part due to the cap, just to make that statement. But it's also that we have to remember that in 2020, jurisdictional subsidies, the board chose to drop them in light of the pandemic time. And so that is a component of the operating gap that we the next is earlier, but you know, there are tools that Metro has to reduce the gap. However, the size of the gap is something that really just cannot be closed without talking about additional that very much needs to be on table. And the scale of the gap, something that really cannot be met by our local governments alone. Especially not in one budget year. Our next finding here is that Virginia is unique. So we have a very unique governance and funding relationship with Metro. I think many of you will recall that chart that we have developed about the funding. And so that needs a unique approach. I do want to state that most of the funding gap is on the rail side, which is where most of the funding is applied. In the Northern Virginia Transportation District, we actually have more bus service provided by agencies than we Metrobus. And when we're thinking about new forms of revenues, there really is no form of revenue that matches precisely or even closely what each jurisdiction's share of the subsidy is by. So, I'm kind of jumping the gun here, but the recommendation is that if we are to find a new funding source, it should be done regionally. And that's within the Northern Virginia. Metro does not have a reserve fund. This is something that was brought up in 2017 by the then general manager during the Keeping Metro Safe, Reliable, and Affordable strategic plan. So it still does not have a reserve fund. And the last finding here is that Metro plays a critical role. Metro plays a critical role in moving the federal workforce. However, fair revenue from federal employees who use transit benefits has significantly dropped, and this reason for the hole in Metro's finances. So on the recommendation side here, the suggested that we do secure one or more sustainable dedicated revenues. And there's some nuance to this recommendation. We do need to define dedicated revenues, and dedicated funding. We have a footnote here below, but it's important that it's restricted for use to Metro. It flows to Metro on an uninterrupted basis. That it's something that's outside of the traditional subsidy process that we're all used to. It needs to be something that Metro can count on and predict. And it needs to be largely, as much as it can be, outside of the traditional annual appropriations process. And we need to consider adjustments for inflation and modal availability. I believe right now the recommendation is neutral on mode to make it the most flexible. So some nuance to this recommendation about dedicated revenues. If we are to collect new revenues from the NVTC district, the suggestion here is that it flows to NVTC and we implement a waterfall approach, something that the commission sort of take policy on. Obviously, new revenues would require enrichment. However, dedicated funding to Metro could be at the top. We could look at a contingency or reserve fund to make sure we could maintain those commitments. And then, there are opportunities if there are any issues about where funds are being raised and how much someone owes, that while we look at funding regionally, we can also try to mitigate any of those impacts where possible. And then lastly, if there is funding left over, there are opportunities to provide that to our local transit agencies that operate with. And then lastly here, our recommendation is to restore the federal presence, employee presence in the Metro system by returning federal government workers to the office and securing a replacement for the region's losses in fares from riders using federal transit benefits. And so as we get to the tail end here, it's important that we talk about capital. Capital is something that needs to be considered. And so, if we're going to keep up this momentum on reducing the state of good repair backlog, while I believe the initial projection for when a dedicated capital funding debt would be exhausted was fiscal 29 or fiscal 30, Metro has a 6-year CIP, just like all of our local governments do, as well as the state. And so in order to make long-term capital decisions, this is something that needs to be addressed in the next few years. And then given the scale and complexity of this larger funding conversation, we'll have to see how things go in the next, you can jump to the next slide, Sophie. We need to see how things progress over the next months and into next year. But NVTC may need to some form, whether it's the same form, a different form, we don't know yet. But depending on how this goes, it could be to look at additional revenues, continue work on components of the solutions that recommendations that we've identified here. It's something that I think we will be flexible on as conversations in the region and with Metro continue, and we'll be prepared to continue some form of process as needed. And then, of course, on the capital side, we do need to fix capital recommendations. As we get to the annual report structure, plan right now is that the first chapter is the Metro Funding Accountability and Reform Recommendations chapter. So the recommendations you saw in here will be basically included in that report. We'll add additional information, and this will form the package that we communicate and send to the Governor and the General Assembly by December 15th to comply with code. So at this point, that was a great deal of information, but it is the preliminary recommendations from a very long staff-driven process. So go ahead and pause here and hand it over to the chair for any questions and discussion.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and apologies to everybody for me being late. So a lot here. I want to thank the working group for all the effort that went into this. A number of these things we've seen before. Correct. I mean, in the annual report that we provide to the General Assembly, some new stuff. I mean, what jumps out to me is failure is not an option. Here, we have to figure this out, and this, I think, does a good job at least setting up a framework where some of these discussions can happen. And I look forward to additional by the work should help support those discussions. Any questions, comments from the members?
I'm happy if there's a pause. I'm happy to.
Differenti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the question, I guess my first agree with everything you said. It feels like a tremendous amount of work that's happened in the last 3 weeks. My sense of it a month back. So a big thank you there. And the work seems differently oriented to reflect where we actually are in where we are in some important ways. I guess my question is slide 14. And then what you talked about, Nate, at 14 mentions an audit committee, and and then there are the pieces that are in purple in the slide, and so I think those are steps in the right direction, but I am not in Metro meetings on a weekly and sometimes daily basis, perhaps like you, Paul. So I kind of would be, yeah, 23 of 24 hours. But I'm interested in kind of your thoughts on that first point on slide 14 about an audit committee, and then this sort of, they don't seem like huge changes, but I am very aware that things that might not seem like huge changes can be, as you've shared over the last couple of years, can be exhausting and counterproductive. And so I didn't know if you have any thought on that one.
So the OIG's office has been a source of a lot of debate over the last several years. We have a new IG, as you know. And a lot of what that office can and can't do, or how it conducts its business and how it interacts with the board, is in the charter or the compact. So it's very clearly laid out. As Nate said, the executive committee serves as the audit committee. We're not called the audit committee, but we serve, as the initial group. But in reality, it's all 8 of us that interact. We've instituted a thing, or I've instituted a thing now. We get regular updates from the OIG on the audits internally. WMATA, the Sullivan, and others has all been restructured in new reporting responsibilities, and that too has enhanced that whole function a great deal. And the coordination between Liz's group and the OIG is really, it's a whole 180 change there. So it's good. There were some changes that I think we should check the last go around, and Andrew. There were some changes to the wording without opening up the compact, but added a layer of responsibility and changes there. So there's a lot going on. A lot of the reports now are made public. They were not in the past. Like I've said, sorry, I'm back to you. There are in these fairly detailed quarterly updates. So it's changed dramatically.
So it sounds almost as though we're nearly substantively already there on almost all 3.
Yeah, we're not there. I mean, we're there. We're just not there in name.
Yeah. So it may be that the optics of making small changes could lead us to fulfill these items, which could help us in the next 3 or 4 months. I don't know.
Yeah, we did have a structure. I know when Christian and I first joined the board in 17 or whenever it was. There was an audit committee and a compensation committee and this committee and that committee, and it was just sort of chaos.
Yeah.
What we have now is far better than what they had back then.
Great. And so I was being perhaps imprecise. It sounds like that function of the 3 that Nate mentioned is effectively working. We can make that argument, and then if it benefits us on the investor relations page and the audit reports and findings, we could talk, if we needed to, eventually we could talk about how we are fulfilling those elements, if it might help us over the next 3 to 5 months as we're working on this in enrichment. So that's a long question, and if you know that like a separate page on investor relations and the findings are not things that we should tweak, if we're already there, we shouldn't create work.
Yeah. Well, I know it's always been a criticism. It's hard at times to find information on the WMATA website. So to Nate's recommendation, maybe, it could be highlighted more prominently on, say, a first or second page or something. And as they both stated in the report, the OIG has his own website. So everything is clearly outlined there, but our partners and the public and others wouldn't necessarily know to go to the WMATA OIG website unless they, I haven't been on this website in a while, actually. And so I'm not sure. I mean, I know there's a link to the OIG's office, but again, I'm not sure how prominent it is to find, the reports. The one other thing too about the audit area, or the joint jurisdictional audit,
Jurisdictions,
it
yeah.
isn't so much about the concept of the audit itself. Everyone agrees it should be done. So just, there's no debate about that. I think where the friction or the tension in the past anyway has come in is Maryland values X, Virginia values Y, the district values Z. And it's those little things that creates all this tension. We also have the situation, it depends on who looks at it in any given year. Let's just say there's a state close by that has the Attorney General's office, the mayor or the governor's office, and say the legislature look at it, and all three come up with three different opinions on what should or shouldn't be emphasized or not. Generally speaking, those differences financially are microscopic in the large scheme of things and don't really address any kind of, in my opinion, any kind of true substantive issues or disagreements or flaws with what WMATA is or isn't doing. It's just how they perceive it from their view. I sound like a diplomat there, but I think you sort of get the point. And I will tell you again, when I first joined the board, I mean, there were extraordinary amount of time spent on these minor differing opinions and views. Let's put it that way. So just to give you some perspective. But no one disagrees with the concept of having a jurisdictional audit that makes it, and honestly, it wastes a lot of time. And it wastes a lot of the WMATA staff time when they could be doing other things. And so I just, just to put some of that into perspective.
And if I can add, that's one of the themes that we found was if there's places where we could recommend that Metro do something once and not like 5 times.
Well,
like
that's
this
the
is-
problem. I
this is
mean,
one of- Yeah.
one issue we spent for minimal amount of dollars. We spent like a year talking about, and it was just, and then it got to a point of just a matter of principle and sort of digging in for no reason, But so hopefully we're beyond that now. We're acting more regionally. The board is regional, so hopefully we can get beyond that. But it would be a great idea.
That's super helpful. I feel like that is a summary of why you just got awarded a national.
And also, some of the dysfunction early on with the departments and everything, then that has been resolved. So, and Liz has been great at coordinating all that internally.
Mr. Walkinshaw.
Thank you. Thank you for all the work. Structure for this conversation, at least. A couple of questions. First, in terms of the recommendations, cost savings or potential cost savings. You anticipate over the course of more dollar amounts or dollar amounts? Is that, I think that's important because we don't want to leave anyone with the impression
Right.
not that they're insignificant, but relative to the gap, they're unlikely to be. So do you intend to do that, or?
I think the intent is, where there is publicly available information, which they have in the past and will continue to cite that for sure. In terms of more broadly speaking, these are we're not assigning numbers to these, both because it's a little outside of the scope, but more that it's, we're trying to have this both at a policy level, but, it's beyond our individual capabilities to come up with.
Yeah.
But I think,
just wouldn't want the General Assembly or someone else to look at it and think that the problem can be
solved.
meaningfully addressed
Right.
by increasing non-fair.
Agreed. And we have recommendations, or findings stating that, the size of the gap is something you need new revenues, but we can definitely find a way to emphasize that point, for sure.
Just a
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah.
Slide 15, I was really struck by the lack of a reserve fund. And obviously, hard to talk about establishing a reserve fund, trying to fill a hole, but I think that could be an important perhaps one of the funding. How it says unlike most transportation agencies. So, for example, on the chart, the early chart that you shared, how would those other transit agencies, and is it, maybe you have to come back and take a look.
Yeah, we need to look.
At all of them, RCTA, LABC, et cetera, have some kind of contingency reserve fund, or most?
Yeah, go.
Yeah, so most of them do, because they're independent agencies, and they have dedicated revenue streams. So they are in control of the revenues that they receive, and therefore, to the extent that they're not using it in a given fiscal year for capital or operating expenses, they can put that into a rainy day fund or other contingencies if you want. Some of them also have various contingency funds that are required because they're associated with certain sales tax measures or other dedicated revenue streams that they receive. So the California agencies in particular have various contingency funds that may be measure specific in addition to the overall contingency funds that they have, keeping in mind that some of these agencies like LA Metro have 4 or 5 different sales tax revenue measures that help to fund them. So MBTA is the only one I'm not quite sure of, because they are technically part of state government and not an independent agency anymore. But the others generally do have these dedicated revenue streams and the ability to save what they don't spend in a given year to address a rainy day.
Okay. And then just final question or point, the last round of dedicated funding in 2018, we know how Virginia came up with its share. My impression, just based on researching it for 5 minutes, is that Maryland used their statewide transportation fund to fund their portion of the 2018 agreement. Is that accurate? Have we?
We need to follow up. Yeah.
But in general, Maryland pays all of its Metro bill with statewide
With
revenue.
the trust.
There's not a local revenue
Right.
associated.
No, I understand that. In 2018, the General Assembly said, yeah, we'll come up with the revenue. We'll take it from Virginia. I'm kind of making the point, and I want to make sure it's accurate, that Maryland has taken a statewide approach to it in the past.
Yeah, so, yeah, they have, James, and the thing we should also understand, and they're, in a sense, dealing with the same thing we are, because their trust fund is basically, bankrupt, or will be very, very soon. So they have established a commission to look at that, and they are doing a lot of the same kind of work here. And I think some of the folks here, Nate and others, are, coordinating with that group. So, Andrew, and so there's a lot of communication there, which is good. But yes, in effect, Maryland strokes one check, the district strokes one check, and we know what Virginia.
Yeah, I think that will be really important for us to have in the final document that goes to the, maybe it's just a statement of fact. That is how they have approached it as a Maryland issue. A lot of times, those of us around this table talk about this as a Northern Virginia issue, when that's not really the case. So, thank you.
Okay, just follow up on Paul.
Yes, Mr. Smedler.
James, when.
I use misters.
Something you said, I think, is interesting. I think whether it's in the report or not, but have the numbers available, the magnitude of things.
Sure.
Because I think a lot of people don't understand that a lot of these recommendations are great, but any combination of them or even one of them in and of itself is not going to solve a 500, 600, 700, 800 million dollar gap. In fact, if anything, like you do with your budgets, you're tinkering on the edges and, and I think some of these, are good to address and we definitely should, but yet it's not going to solve the issue. Yeah. And I think it's important for people to understand that because I think the public in particular, there's a feeling like, oh, we'll just raise fares and the federal government's coming back and okay, we're done. Yeah. And that is clearly not the case.
Right.
So
I think we'll do the best we can to emphasize that point. One of our challenges here is that we're also, trying to integrate this process into what is understandably a moving target because Metro's budget process, just like any local or state budget process, it goes through changes. There are updates. This is going to be a static report, and so we want to make sure that we can capture things accurately, cite Metro, but we don't want to be wrong. We don't want to provide out-of-date information. We don't want to misconstrue things. So it's a challenge, but it's something that we'll work towards.
Yeah, I mean, even a range.
yeah.
Mr. Smith. Mr. Snyder.
So Andrew, I wanted to ask something about the 12.
Yeah.
So tell me about that second bullet.
So
because and let me tell you the reason.
recommendation. Sure.
Yeah, the recommendation. Yeah. So I think a lot of people perceive the Better Bus redesign more as an expansion potentially of service in the network. But here we seem to be saying something different.
Right.
So how did you all come up with that bullet?
Right. So this
the wording.
In a way, the wording here is, I think, sort of taken and updated from the 2017 load report that said to find efficiencies, redesign the bus network, find efficiencies. I think right now the bus network redesign, the way that process was structured is they went for the visionary network plan first, and it would be more resources from the region. They are shifting right now and into the fall and into winter into sort of what the year one plan would be, which is something about what we have now. So the vision plan went first, and then they're kind of building what the current network could look like. And so our recommendation here is, when you're doing that, do it in a way that finds some level of cost savings. So we're not assigning a number to it or anything like that. It's just more of a policy recommendation kind of concept. So there is a lot more to come from the Better Bus Network redesign team, is I think what I'm saying.
Yeah, we all know that, but if someone's just reading this and
I
doesn't
see,
know a
I
lot
see.
about
Yeah, sure.
Metro, are we
Okay.
giving them the impression that the Better Bus redesign is gonna, you may find a lot of route efficiencies
Sure.
and cleaning up things and everything, but is it really gonna lead to like cost? I'm not, that's all, just a thought. I just, it came up today. We had a call with the Northern Virginia state delegation legislators, so the state reps and the senators. We had a dozen or so. Yeah. And the Better Bus redesign. So
This, I think, we'll stay close on this recommendation, and it'll iterate, as we have opportunities with the committee and the commission, but also as that process continues, since it will take.
it'll take a while.
It'll take a while. Yeah.
And just one other thing too about the audit thing, because I had that
Mhm.
question marked as well. I basically talk to the IG every week, about a couple times a week on a whole host of things. But just.
Thank you, Mr. Svedberg. Mr. Snyder, then Mr. Kipnis.
So let me go back to staff perspective of us at this meeting. Is this an up or down vote? Is this an initial discussion? We'll have another discussion before we go to the commission. Because there's a lot of vetting I want to do.
Yeah.
My staff with
with the general public, get more of a sense about what's really doable. I hate that term, but I'll use it anyway. What's really doable in the environment in which we exist. So what are we giving initial reactions tonight, or what are?
Yeah, my understanding is that's what we're looking for. It's initial reactions. There's no vote tonight.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, process wise, yeah, Mr. Chair, so process wise, I'm gonna go a little bit backwards. We plan on seeking approval or from the commission for these to be included in a report, as well as if necessary, our legislative agenda in December. That's when there would be potentially 2 votes within the commission. So November, we plan on presenting this in a discussion sort of workshop at the commission. So here we're sitting here in the middle of September. So we do have a fair amount of time. The reason we wanted to bring this to you now, again, is we've been talking at the staff, obviously a ton of work that the team's been putting. We wanted to get a temperature check. What are we missing? What do we need to add? The feedback so far has been fantastic. But there's time for this to continue to percolate. And I think the other part of it is, as Andrew suggested, is we also know that WMATA is in the process of developing their 25 budget. And so we want to make sure that the information that's here is relevant when we're getting closer to presenting this to the commission. We expect, I think everybody understands the next couple of weeks or so, we might see some updated information. That's going to be helpful. So yeah, so are we on the right path? Are we going in the right direction? Are there things that you have big concerns with? That's really what this is today. Yeah.
Okay, with that in mind, just a couple thoughts. The discussion of the 3% cap. There's some vague language about created ambiguity or something. I mean, I personally like the 3% cap because I think it imposes a fair amount of discipline. Now, I also realize that we've not kept up with inflation, so we need to do something about that. But I got confused by the language on the 3% cap. On 15, I mean, the real core is so we have this study that showed the massive amount of tax revenue generated by our transit systems, which a report which I think we must believe because we issued it. And yet we're almost letting the state this. So I'm a little bit reluctant to give up the ground that really this is really a state responsibility. That may not play out well, but the state's sitting on so much money that I guess they're giving it back. So kind of an interesting, I'm not sure any of our local governments are going to be nearly in that kind of a position in the next couple of years as our wages keep up with inflation and all the other costs. The very same things that Metro is having to deal with. So that would be an area. And I can't get away from the dichotomy of expanding service and saying we need more money in order to stay afloat. It just, you don't run your own budgets that way. You figure out how much, a lot of people do it differently, but one way is you figure out how much you have, you figure out what your needs are, and you act accordingly. You don't wish that you had more. So I'm still wrestling with that, how to explain to the public that. And I know that's the prevailing view, and that's the view of we're not a manager, but I don't think it's going to sell very well. So I'd like to see more examples of if we had service that really matched current revenues or services matched revenues that kept up with inflation, as opposed to top of the flight service and then massive deficits. I don't know. It's all to say that I'd like more information and more discussion about what the environment is that we're operating in now and what's reasonable to do. And I think the fundamental question is you're expanding service and then you're saying to the public, well, pay for it, even though still haven't recovered ridership. Well, I don't know.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Karatonis.
Mr. Snyder almost stole my thunder. I remember Mr. Clark arguing that they were trying to do more with what they had, significantly more. They restructured service on Metro. And he actually directly connected that to the improvement of the ridership, which is significant. It's not. So where do we make this kind of a positive statement to say, look, if we stabilize the system, we can actually make the system in this unstable and predictable status. The system will wield and will, be in a tailspin continuously, and we will have a chronic drag on the system. There is also a piece on the Metrobus subsidy, with the design of Metrobus service network. So subsidy increased in Virginia while service decreased. This is not completely shocking. It happens sometimes because the marginal cost of service may go up, and this is something that you have then to face. And sometimes you do a combination of both. You have to pay more. You have to accept that less service will be. So that if we just put it in front of somebody in Richmond, they may misinterpret that. So I personally believe that this has to be just more measured or more balanced representation of that. And I fully understand that there are jurisdictions that have very legitimate concerns about the service they receive. Fairfax, for example. There are other jurisdictions that have way less reasons to complain, like Arlington County. So I take account of that, but this is why it's so important to maybe spend a little bit of time or effort to focus on internal shifts of service to cost. The current leadership of Metro is doing, because he was arguing here at the PTC meeting that this is how we get the people back by reshuffling, by providing service when people need it, et cetera, et cetera. So that is something I was missing in this.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey, and then.
Yeah. So, basic question. Apologies because I'm kind of in a way a public communications tool. I mean, is this going to be? This is to inform. So, there are a lot of things that we all know that maybe will be in here, but I don't know the issue of margin, fixed costs, and marginal change. Most people don't know that, don't understand it, and it's huge. Why can't you just, back to Mr. Snyder's go, why can't you just cut this and don't increase that and you're going to be fine? Well, no, right? So I think you have to lay that out. I think you might want to have an introduction about how very different Metro is from any other transportation system maybe in the world. It's just crazy. And people they just assume we're like everybody else, because most people don't think that. And you need to lay it out. Okay, okay. The salaries, I'm so pleased to see that, Paul. I have been saying it for a long time that we ought to get salaries for it's ridiculous. You get ZIP, and Maryland gets, I don't know, 70, what it's 1,000 get, right? Something like that. So that's put back to somebody else said, can we put in some numbers? Because people don't know, they don't know. So I would have a little, this is what Virginia, this is what Maryland, and this is what Virginia gets. It's crazy. The other thing about, so the 3% cap, I will say, as a local elected, that's kind of a security blanket for me. And I'm worried that we might say, well, we'll just raise it to 4% or whatever, and the jurisdictions can, will be fine. That sort of statement, I think, is not going to be fine. We can't do it. And I think that needs to be made little clearer. Maybe when you do the, unlike any other area, you can say, so state of Maryland understands the value of Metro and how important it is to their state budget, and so the whole state supports Metro. District does that. Virginia, on the other hand, leaves it to, although Northern Virginia provides, what was it, 75% of the state revenue? I mean, it's some huge amount that we provide. Maybe it's not that much. We have to put it all up on our own. And it is at this point stretching localities' budgets to the bit. They can't keep doing it. So anyway, I'm kind of going on and on here, but I just think you just need to lay that out a lot more. But we all know it, and it's a problem because we all talk to each other. And I just
Absolutely.
think people don't.
There is a significant amount of state aid that does come to our jurisdictions, but we can help paint the full picture.
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, and maybe,
Yep.
paint it in a certain
Right.
hue. And then if the feds were to cut us a check to get us back to where they were before, would we care if there were people wrote or not? You see what I'm saying?
Well, that would be great. However, it doesn't address the underlying financial model that is broken. It helps, help.
Right. But the thing, but in a way,
It's not coming.
yeah, okay.
Don't hope for it.
No, I won't. But in
Right.
a way, we're saying,
Right.
I always read, people have to come back to work because we need money. It just doesn't look right. So maybe you need to just put in a little thing, because the model is such, if the federal government is going to continue on depend, and they will, whether people come in 2 days a week or 5 days a week, they're going to continue to depend on it. They got to support us. So they've got to get people in, or they got to find another way to fill the gap. That's
Yeah. Well, and to the point of ridership, I forgot who mentioned it earlier. It's been going up and up and up. And in 8 days, we could potentially see the government close down again. Who knows how long? And boom. So there's another chunk of money we're going to be missing out on because we have a shutdown. But to your point, your first point, it is amazing to me. That one simple fact, and Nate would know better than I do. But I think it's fair to say, of any mid-size or large system in the country, we are the only one without dedicated funding. And Nate, I think that's
and we may be the only one in the world. Maybe that's going a little far, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's little systems here and there, but in general, I think that too is a fair statement. But sure, national, for a system our size and the importance of our system to the region's economy and everything, we are truly unique in that sense.
So, and I'll just stop. I just think you need to, in a way, look at what most people, if it's a communications tool, most people haven't got a clue. And they think if Metro's not making money, it's because Metro's doing something.
Yeah, and they think
There's
the
something wrong with
annual
us, right?
appropriations that the various states and the district and you all make are dedicated, but it's obviously not the case.
Right.
And these are reasonable assumptions for people to make. They've
Of course.
shown how unreasonable it all is.
Well, I know Randy, general manager, has been trying to sort of shift some of that debate by saying, well, look, transit in general is viewed differently in other parts of the country. It's viewed as a public utility type of model, and that's what it is. And it's never going to make money, yet the value is in other ways. So,
All right, Mr. DeFrente, and then I think we'll move on.
Sure, sorry, I appreciate it. So to your question, Dave, it feels like this is a micro orientation to our problem. We knew 3 months ago we had a Metro World, and so an example of that, on the 13th, I spoke to the Alliance, and I haven't had a chance to report out, but I think it is salient because of some questions that I got asked, and so I feel like I think it's just worth naming that the election will have a massive impact on this, and so in that sense, an extended, detailed discussion. This is fantastic policy work, but an extended, detailed discussion seems in part dependent upon those results, which I think about almost every day. So you just asked for sort of direction on the report. And so I think you've done some thinking about funding opportunities or ways, but I would say that in chapter 1 of the report, I don't know that I feel that it extended discussion of those funding options is particularly necessary. And so I just wanted to make sure that we were aligned on that.
Right, and if I can respond, the menu of revenue options that the working group is looking at that you have not seen yet, we'll have it in a month. That is going to be in the working group technical report. That is not the action that will be before the commission in December. So,
Got it. And then
Yeah.
mindful you want to move on. There are two specific edits that come to mind. Structural, just because I think no matter what the next election means, structural growth, I like the word structural analysis rather than structural growth. Yes, it will be growth, but I just don't see, and I could be wrong, I don't see Richmond responding as well to growth as analysis, even if it is managing growth. But that's 2 cents. And then, you always get in trouble when we're speculating, but chapter 1, I feel like Metro accountability, reform, and funding is how I would. I mention those things because I think those are things that might impact how you approach thinking about the report over the next month, and that's what the task that I thought you guys wanted, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could, just one other quick thing, Nate and Andrew. We don't have to talk about it now, but, the labor negotiations.
Right.
You had, I forgot what slide it's on, but comes up a lot. So, just, I don't, how we, engage in that or state any, well, we don't obviously, but it comes up a lot that you as NVTC may get asked about.
I did.
Prepare yourself.
Almost, yeah. Almost, yeah.
All right, if there's nothing else on that, then next we have the zero emission bus, right?
Sorry, that was the other committee meeting.
It just happened to be.
Okay, so we are going to,
We already talked about this, it's all done.
well, thank you.
Fairfax is going diesel.
I think it would be biodiesel.
So now we're going to talk about actually something Mr. Tarantonis just talked about a little bit, which is Metro bus service and subsidy. And maybe not for individual local governments, but I think as a region, we've been looking at the challenge of basically, what are we getting for, what are we paying for? And the trend lines have not been regional. So head, Andrew, I guess you and Sophie.
Yeah, I'm going to do a brief introduction here and then hand it over to Sophie and then sort of give more findings, so to speak, at the end. But what Sophie's going to do is give us a brief update on bus service and subsidy trends that we've seen. These slides should hopefully look familiar. They're an update to a version we gave to this committee back, I think it was July of last year. So we just added another year of data to that. And I think the purpose here is to everyone can make informed policy decisions. And then it does link back to some of the findings and recommendations from the prior slides about formula, about the cap, things like that. So why don't I hand it over to Sophie?
Great, so I'm going to begin broadly with just who provides bus service in the region and within the WMATA compact area. So bus service is provided by Metrobus and a mixture of local transit providers. I won't go over the Virginia providers, I'm sure you're familiar, but just a reminder that DC local service is provided by DC Circulator and Maryland local service is provided by Ride On in Montgomery and Bus in PG County. And you can see that all on the map behind me. And so now I want to go over a few key events in the timeline, Metrobus subsidy and service. So this is going to kind of lay some groundwork for how we think about the dynamic between Metrobus, local service, and Metrobus subsidy. So we're going to begin on the top half of the slide, which shows Metrobus and local Metrobus and local service key events that have affected the amount and distribution of bus service. So the first thing I'm going to point out is that over this time period, there have been a number of local takeovers of Metrobus routes. And these are dependent on policy choices of our local providers. And then we'll move to 2018, which was a difficult budget year for Metro. There were quite a few Metrobus routes that were shortened or discontinued. Then after this, there was a bit of stability until the pandemic began in 2020, which then led to some temporary service reductions of both Metrobus and our local providers. Many of these Metrobus routes have since been restored, but not all of them. And then moving on to September of 2021, which is fiscal year 2022, WMATA implemented some route restorations as well as the Metrobus 12 and 10 minute that affected routes in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And a good example of this is the 28A on Route 7, which saw frequency improvements to every 12 minutes. And then finally, all the way on the right, we're going to look towards the present and future. We've already talked about this today, but the Better Bus Network redesign is underway and it needs to be a more efficient network. And then finally, as you all know, the operating system and federal aid is exhausted. So now the bottom side of the bottom half of the slide, we're going to look at the timeline of Metrobus subsidy. So the last major update to the Metrobus formula, which is how we allocate the subsidy, was in 1998. The next change was 22 years later in FY 2020 when the Metro Board adopted a new subsidy calculation that to align with the legislative 3% operating cap that was enacted by Virginia and Maryland. So the new method means that Virginia, Maryland, and DC all get a 3% increase, as we were just talking about earlier, in their subsidy, no matter how service has changed. And the Metro subsidy formula that was adopted in 1998 is still in place and is still utilized for certain components of the subsidy calculation. And then again, the bus network redesign is also on this part of the timeline because the study calls for an update to how we allocate the bus subsidy. And that's in recognition of a lot has changed since 1998 and that service will change with the new bus network. And I also want to highlight that since 2016, bus fare box recovery rates have been declining, which is an important factor driving increases in the Metrobus subsidy over time. And then a part of that declining fare box recovery is in part due to fare evasion. As you might remember, normalized fare evasion, but didn't put in any administrative procedures to enforce it until last year. And then after which Metro restarted an enforcement campaign in the district.
Oh, in the region too. Oh, you're right. Yep. Sorry.
Okay.
My bad. It's late.
So now we're going to move on and talk a little bit about the distribution of bus service from 2009 to 2021, fiscal year 2009 to fiscal year. So on this slide, we are looking at both Metrobus and then local service providers. So you're seeing Maryland, DC, and Virginia local service, and each one of those lines is a total of that jurisdiction. So Virginia is a total of all of our bus. Maryland is a total of right and the bus and the circulator. So you can see that historically Metrobus service has been stable. There's a few minor dips. There's one during the Great Recession in 2010, and then another in 2018 during that bad budget year that I just mentioned. But then when we look down at the local service, which is those three different types of dotted lines, Maryland, DC look mostly stable across this period, but the real story here is Virginia. It's climbed throughout the decade through a combination of those local service additions and takeovers of the Metrobus, of some Metrobus. And then this ties nicely to the main point here, which is that Virginia is unique in the region, which Ingrid has already said the sentence. Another way Virginia is unique in the region, and it's that in that bus service is primarily provided by local agencies. So now I'm going to move over and talk a little bit more about Metrobus service over time, specifically with the focus from fiscal year 2016 to 2024. So in this slide, we're focusing on the share of Metrobus service between the three jurisdictions and then how that's changed over this period. So the trends map what we've discussed the whole time in the other slides. There's stability through the years, temporary dip during the pandemic, and then you can also see that shift in fiscal year 2023 with the introduction. And the key here is the change over time, which you can see on the right hand of the screen. Over time, DC has declined a little bit. Maryland actually gained 8%, and Virginia's total service declined by 11%. So what happened with that? Why is that happening? It's Metrobus's service was temporarily reduced because of the pandemic. When it was restored, it came back in a different way. So both this restoration of service and the 12 and 20-minute frequency network significantly redistributed service towards Maryland and away from Virginia. And why did this happen? How did this shift happen? So you've probably heard this before, but essentially pre-pandemic customers are different than post-pandemic customers. Many of Virginia bus routes were commuter-oriented, a 9-to-5 type of service. Ridership of commuter-oriented routes has not recovered, but independent riders have come back in numbers. So Metro moved their service towards recovery in the frequent line with an all-day service plan, ridership travel patterns, less peak and more or higher off-peak travel. And this frequent service plan also benefits low-income and minority riders and takes advantage of the ish free bus rail. And now we're going to move to the other side of the equation here, which is the operating subsidy. And so we're looking at that same time period of fiscal year 2016 to 2024. But now we're looking at the operating subsidy for Maryland, DC, and Virginia. So the big thing I want to highlight here is the subsidy for everyone from Metro has gone up over this time period. This makes sense, as I mentioned earlier, decreasing fare box recovery rates and the pandemic impacted this time period. But when we take a closer look, we can see that the percent increase for the jurisdictions is uneven. We saw on the last slide that Virginia lost service over this time period, but the subsidy still increased substantially. All right, okay. And so I mentioned earlier the 3% cap has changed the way that subsidy is calculated, and that's what we're seeing reflected here with that disconnect between subsidy and service. So the major takeaway here is that Metrobus subsidy calculations are not adequately reflecting how service has changed. And therefore, this is the part that I underlined. Virginia is getting less Metrobus service and paying more for it. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Andrew to kind of tie everything up together.
Perfect. So I think you've heard a lot of these. We're unique in the region. The way services run here is often a little different. That's the policy decisions of our local governments as well as the Metro Board. But with that distribution of service, the changes that we're seeing, again, the way subsidies are being calculated, we're seeing that distortion, and that is in part due to, I think, an old Metrobus formula that should be updated, but it's also so. There's sort of a complex interaction of issues here that are creating the distortions that we're seeing. The intent of these slides is to sort of highlight these trends, highlight these concerns, make sure that folks are aware, and then feed them back into findings and recommendations that were sort of on the previous slides, but that would go. But the primary next steps here are sort of, as we discussed earlier, keep engaging in the bus network redesign process, both on the service side, but on formula. And then, this distortion is also why we had certain language in relation to revising the 3% cap that can, in a way, allow formula to, I think, be more responsive. So that's sort of the primary link backs and conclusions and next steps. So at that point, we can pause for any questions and discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Andrew. I guess one thing, and maybe this is hard to measure because it's more of a visual thing for me, but Kate, I think someone mentioned Metrobus as being more of a commuter, well, at least the commuter routes that have been, really haven't come back. And I guess, it's my observation, maybe with the exception of the 28A and maybe another route, vast majority of Metrobus routes are what I would say more legacy. They're going out and in, they're going out and in, and they're not doing the lateral movement that I think,
A lot of people want.
yeah, that a lot of people want, exactly. And also reflecting where a lot of the growth has been, be it, the Dulles corridor, wherever. I guess is that one of the structural things that it's possible to look at as part of this analysis, or because it does seem to me just visually that, I mean, maybe for no fault of itself, Metro Bus is more legacy population pattern, and yet in the last 20, 30 years, that's totally changed. I don't know if that's something
I think it's something we can
look
take
at.
back and think about, because we are doing a lot of work. Obviously, the best bus network redesign is going on over at Metro, but also MVTC, we have our regional bus analysis that is underway. Xavier Harvey is leading that. And it's kind of look at some of those things where there are opportunities for efficiencies. It doesn't mean things have changed. Bus programs are a lot of legacy things. A lot of other transit agencies around the country have done these redesigns to basically get rid of legacy things, because you tweak a system for 30 years, it's not being responsive. It's time to kind of wipe it clean and start over from scratch. I think we're all trying to get there. But these are really good observations we can take back, because Andrew, Xavier, and a couple folks in our office are heavily involved with Metro and with our regional bus study here to make sure we want to get the best we can out of the system we have and the limited dollars with the transit, make sure we're getting the most out.
No, I that would be great. And I also realize that we also have a legacy road system in our region. So everything goes into the center and comes out for the most part anyway. And I guess as part of that review, I would be interested in, and I got stuck in it, I think just an hour or so ago, the reverse routes on buses. So, what is ridership looking like? Starting closer in the core and moving out. Yeah, and that might be one way of at least taking a look at some of that and how population work patterns have changed. Mr. DiFrente.
I think my recollection is that you and Jeff and Fairfax has raised this fairly often, and I think I have not taken. I mean, talk about the 23 was when I was in high school, and I just don't think it's packed when I've seen it. But that's anecdotal and not evidentiary. I'm less familiar with the tectonics on this discussion than I am on the metro as a whole. And I think, Paul, your comments earlier pointed out that there's ambiguity how this discussion fits into the metro discussion. So I don't have to be involved in those conversations. I just think we need to work on that issue, because you could sequence better bus redesign to have reductions in service or efficiencies, not reductions, but efficiencies in the short term. But that is not the way I've heard Randy describe it, and not what I think is the best medium to long term for our region. So I don't want to say too much. I just think there's a whole lot under the surface that we have to figure out, so that the metro conversation, this has to be fixed, but I don't know whether we can address all the policy points in it in the short term. But we do have to think of how this fits into the metro conversation in a very short term, if that makes sense. And so I don't know what the top line is. You pointed out, there's a calibrating that bullet point is important, and there's a whole lot of thinking that I think would go underneath getting that done, and that's important for, I think, Fairfax. It's also important for the chair of Fairfax to be engaged in those discussions too, because I know he has feelings about it. So that's a way of hoping that we can punt, or there's some really smart people figuring this out that we might not be able to do in the next 10 minutes.
Okay. Carrington.
Thank you. As a frequent user of 1A, I understand the hub and spoke issue. So, and also I have to say, in defense of WMATA, Better Bus is actually trying to rationalize the network and understand better from where to where and how. The measure here is that the subsidy, the Virginia pays for upkeeping a service, for not literally, closing down a service, because it is needed to run the entirety. It fits the entirety of the transportation network of Virginia. And hub and spoke plays a role. If I had to, I agree on. Now, for a very long time, we would say WMATA would provide the core, and we will provide the laterals, right? The last mile, or then the cobweb. So this is really true that this hasn't happened yet. And it's not so easy in a system that faces so many challenges. So what I want to understand is, so the per operating hour subsidy has gone up everywhere. So this is universal, right? Virginia has just had more subsidies to pay because there were less. I mean, the delta was just higher. That doesn't mean that we pay too much for less service. I mean, at the bottom line, I understand that this is the argument, but there are operational reasons for that as well. Not only the crookedness of the 3% and the unintended effects of that. I just don't want to over. I mean, suggesting that there is a calculation problem here.
Right.
This is also structural, how the service is actually apportioned over the region.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you make a really good point, and don't take my comments wrong. I mean, I think the Better Bus project is a good one, because I think it is trying to address some of those issues. I was just concerned about how the public and the people that we're going to have to convince to fix this issue are going to look at this and think about it. That's all. I just, and how does your investment in your local bus systems, which has been very robust over the last 12 years, how is that all going to work and complement each other? I think that's what that Better Bus project is all about. So you're right. And just the bigger issue too. It was 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. People out here are going to the core. And now the challenge the royal we have, people are living in the district and commuting out to Reston and, Tyson's Corner and Ballston and Eisenhower Valley. People are using the system very differently than they have in the past. And Libby, you're right too. People want the lateral or, vertical, routes and connecting, people are looking at all that very differently, and younger people in particular. And we're seeing it on the weekends and later hours with the flat fare. It's really helped. It's attracting new people to the system.
Other comments, questions?
Let's not have a shutdown. I mean, 8 days, let's not, think about all the things that daily are coming forward, and that is outside of our control. But
I'll second that motion.
I mean,
there was a time that in this region, we were thinking of the bus system being an 80% subsidy, 20% fare box, while Metro was the opposite, which is just, this is unique in the world. So
those 9 to 5 commuters were the bread and butter. Rail was the bread and butter. Yeah.
So welcome to the laws of gravity apply. So that's
a lot in flux.
Yeah. All right. Any last
Just a couple reminders about the next couple of
Yes.
committees. On October 19th, we're gonna have a joint MBTC WMATA and Legislative Policy Committee. That's in the same room. We don't have any more WMATA only committees scheduled yet, but we're, as you know, we're gonna keep track of the FY25 budget very closely as things are allowed. And we'll work closely with you, Mr. Chair, and our board members. If we need to reconvene the group, we'll be in touch. But the next one is approximately a little less than a month from now, 6 p.m. And we'll be talking with the Joint Committee and talk through revenues and have more of this conversation with you all. So thank you all for this is great feedback on this. Is exactly what we needed.
All right. So any more items for the committee? If not, we are joined. Thank you very much to staff. Excellent work. And we're adjourned.
Mr. Chair.